They started calling me the Maid the summer I turned 32. Not to my face at first. Families like mine don't insult you directly. They wrap cruelty in laughter. They disguise it as a joke. And if you dare look hurt, they tell you you're too sensitive, that you can't take a little fun. I was standing in my sister-in-law Clarissa's kitchen when I first heard it. I had my hands deep in soapy water because no one else had bothered to clear the dinner plates. My brother Darren and his wife hosted Sunday dinners for the whole family, but somehow, every single time, I ended up cleaning. My mother would sit at the table, sipping sweet tea, telling stories about Darren's childhood like he'd cured cancer instead of selling mid-level insurance policies. My father would grunt in approval, and I would rinse, scrub, dry, repeat. That night, Clarissa leaned toward my cousin Patrice and whispered loud enough for the room to hear. "At least we don't need to hire help. We've got one built in." They both giggled. I felt it in my spine before I understood it, that chill, that awareness that something about me had shifted in their eyes. I turned slightly, dish towel in hand, and Clarissa smiled sweetly. "Oh, Leela, honey, you don't mind, do you? You're so good at this." Good at this? As if I'd been born with a sponge in my hand instead of a degree in hospitality management that none of them took seriously. I had once told them I dreamed of managing a boutique hotel. My father laughed so hard he coughed. "Hotels? Baby, that's just glorified cleaning." And somehow, from that day on, I became exactly what they said I was. When Darren and Clarissa hosted parties, I was the one refilling chip bowls. When my mother needed help organizing her closet, I drove across town. When Patrice threw her baby shower, guess who stayed behind after everyone left to scrape icing off folding tables? Me. And they praised me for it. That's the cruelest part. They told me I was dependable, selfless. "You're just the caring type, Leela," my mother would say. "Not everyone has ambition like Darren." Ambition, as if kindness and ambition could not exist in the same woman, as if quiet strength was weakness. Every year in July, they took a family vacation to a luxury beachfront resort called Blue Haven Shores. I never went. The first year, I couldn't afford it. I was still paying off student loans and working 2 jobs, one at a small event venue and another doing bookkeeping for a local cafe. The second year, they forgot to tell me the booking deadline. The third year, Clarissa told me gently, "It's really more of a couples thing, Leela. You'd be bored." But every year I watched their photos online, infinity pools, oceanfront balconies, my mother in oversized sunglasses captioning her pictures, "Family is everything." And then there were the inside jokes, the way Darren would say, "Leela can't relate. She's not exactly resort material." They'd laugh. I'd smile thinly and say nothing. What they didn't know was that Blue Haven Shores fascinated me, not because of the luxury, but because I understood resorts. I understood service. I understood the invisible hands that made vacations magical. I knew how many staff members it took to keep those pools sparkling. I knew the scheduling, the vendor contracts, the seasonal fluctuations. While they mocked me, I studied. I worked quietly under a general manager at the event venue who saw something in me no one else did. Mr. Alvarez was nearing retirement and had spent 30 years in hospitality. He noticed how I reorganized storage rooms without being asked, how I improved guest feedback scores just by suggesting small changes. One evening, as we closed up after a wedding, he said, "Leela, you don't belong behind the scenes forever." I laughed it off. "Tell that to my family." He looked at me carefully. "Your family doesn't sign your paychecks." That sentence lived in me. Meanwhile, the jokes at home escalated. At my father's 60th birthday dinner, Darren raised a glass and said, "We couldn't have pulled this off without our very own Cinderella." He gestured toward me. "Except she actually likes cleaning." The room erupted. My mother didn't correct him. She smiled. I felt my face burn, but I clinked glasses anyway. Later that night, while scraping candle wax from the tablecloth, I overheard Clarissa again. "Honestly, it's kind of sad," she murmured. 32 and still single, still doing odd jobs. At least she's useful." Useful. That word landed differently. Not worthless, not incapable, just useful, like furniture, like a broom. I went home that night and cried harder than I had in years, not because they called me the maid, but because a small part of me had started believing them. I began asking myself dangerous questions. Maybe they're right. Maybe I aim too high. Maybe hospitality management is just cleaning in a nicer uniform. Maybe I should be grateful they let me tag along at all. But then Mr. Alvarez announced he was selling his share in a boutique coastal property 2 states away, a struggling one. It needed renovation, rebranding, restructuring. He asked if I wanted to see it. I almost said no, because who was I to imagine owning something like that? But something inside me, something wounded and tired of being useful, whispered yes. The first time I stood in that fading lobby, I didn't see peeling wallpaper. I saw potential. I saw warm lighting, refinished wood floors, staff trained to treat guests like family instead of transactions. I saw a place where people like me wouldn't be invisible. Mr. Alvarez said he was looking for a partner, someone hungry, someone who understood heart over hype. I thought about my family sipping cocktails at Blue Haven Shores. I thought about the way they dismissed my degree. I thought about resort material. And for the first time in my life, I allowed myself to want something big. Not to prove them wrong, not yet, but to prove myself right. I emptied my savings. I took a calculated loan. I signed papers with trembling hands. I worked 18-hour days, overseeing renovations, marketing strategies, staff training programs. I learned about investor relations and seasonal tourism trends. I made mistakes. I corrected them. I grew thicker skin. And slowly, that struggling property began turning a profit. Meanwhile, back home, I was still the maid, still the dependable one, still the single sister with modest shoes and quiet dreams. I didn't tell them about the property. I didn't tell them about the bookings increasing every quarter. I didn't tell them that Mr. Alvarez planned to step back fully within 3 years, leaving majority ownership to me. Some secrets are sacred when they're still fragile. But every July, when the Blue Haven Shores photos appeared online, something shifted inside me. Not jealousy, not anymore. Strategy. I started researching that resort, its parent company, its financial structure, its debt, its declining reviews masked by glossy marketing. I read everything because I had learned something powerful. When people underestimate you, they stop watching you. And when they stop watching you, you are free. The first summer after I invested in that struggling coastal property, my family still didn't know. They saw me as they always had, quiet, helpful, available, and I let them. There's a certain advantage in being underestimated. People don't guard their words around you. They don't consider you a threat. They show you exactly who they are. That July, Blue Haven Shores flooded my social media feed again. Clarissa posted a video tour of their oceanfront suite, twirling dramatically on the balcony, while Darren narrated like he owned the place. "This is how you vacation when you work hard," he said into the camera. "Not everyone can relate." I knew that line was for me. My mother commented with 3 heart emojis and "so proud of my successful children." Children, plural, as if I were included, yet somehow invisible at the same time. They'd invited me that year, technically, a last-minute text from Darren. "We've got a pull-out couch if you want it, but you'd probably rather stay back and hold down the fort." I declined politely. I said I had work. Which was true. That week, I was negotiating contracts with a travel influencer to promote our renovated property. I was finalizing staff bonuses because our guest satisfaction scores had climbed into the 90% range. I was reviewing proposals to expand our spa services. But none of that would have impressed them. To my family, success only counted if it came with loud titles and flashy cars. Mine came with spreadsheets and late nights. A few weeks after they returned from the resort, Darren hosted another Sunday dinner. I arrived with a homemade peach cobbler because that's who I was then, still trying to contribute in the only ways they acknowledged. Clarissa greeted me with air kisses and handed me a stack of napkins before I'd even set my purse down. "You don't mind setting up, do you? You're just so good at making things look presentable." There it was again, presentable, as if my existence were decorative labor. During dinner, the conversation turned, as it often did, toward money. Darren had received a modest promotion and spoke about it as though he'd conquered Wall Street. My father beamed. "That's real ambition," he said, "climbing ladders." Then his eyes drifted to me. "What about you, Lila? Still at that little party hall?" I swallowed. I could have told them. I could have said, "I co-own a growing coastal property now. I oversee a team of 40. I'm restructuring debt and improving occupancy rates." But I knew how it would go. Skepticism, dismissal, jokes about towels and toilet paper. So I said simply, "I'm doing well." Clarissa tilted her head. "Well is relative." Laughter. Always laughter. Later, as usual, I cleared plates, but this time something was different inside me. I wasn't shrinking, I was observing. Darren leaned back in his chair and said, "You know what's funny? Every year at Blue Haven, the staff treat us like royalty. They remember our names, our drink preferences. It's top-tier service." He shook his head approvingly. "That's how you run a place." I dried a glass slowly. "It takes a lot of structure to maintain that," I said calmly. "Training, consistency, incentives." He shrugged. "I guess, but it's not rocket science. Just hire good maids." The word hung in the air. My mother gave a small, uncomfortable smile, but said nothing. And in that moment, I stopped waiting for her to defend me. That realization hurt more than Clarissa's giggles. I had spent years believing that if I were just patient enough, kind enough, helpful enough, they would eventually see me, they would respect me. But respect isn't earned by servitude, it's claimed by self-definition. That night, I went home and opened my laptop. I pulled up financial reports I'd been quietly studying for months. Blue Haven Shores wasn't as invincible as it looked. Its parent company had expanded too quickly. Reviews mentioned inconsistent service, high staff turnover, declining maintenance. The glossy photos hid cracks, literal and financial. I reached out discreetly to a former colleague of Mr. Alvarez who specialized in acquisitions. I didn't say I wanted to buy Blue Haven. That sounded absurd even to me. Instead, I asked about market valuations for mid-size luxury resorts with declining management structures. He sent data, numbers I stared at for hours. The purchase price would be astronomical for me alone, but not impossible with strategic investors. And suddenly the dream sharpened. Not revenge exactly, not at first. It was something deeper, reclamation. Every time they'd said I wasn't resort material, they'd reduced my expertise to housekeeping. They'd never considered that the person polishing the glass might one day own the building. The next year was a blur of expansion for my own property. We rebranded with a softer, more intimate identity. We prioritized staff well-being. I instituted a policy that every employee, from front desk to groundskeeping, had a voice in weekly improvement meetings because I knew what it felt like to be invisible. Profits rose steadily. Investors noticed. I reinvested everything. I lived modestly, drove the same aging sedan, wore simple clothes to family dinners. Let them believe I was stuck. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, I assembled a quiet coalition. 2 private investors and Mr. Alvarez, who believed in my vision enough to back me again. When the acquisition opportunity for Blue Haven Shores officially surfaced, buried in a trade publication most casual readers would miss, I was ready. Negotiations took months. There were setbacks, moments I doubted my sanity. Who was I to step into something that massive? But then I remembered Clarissa's voice. At least she's useful. And instead of anger, I felt clarity. I wasn't doing this to humiliate them. I was doing it to prove that usefulness is power when you own it. The deal closed in late spring. I signed documents in a quiet office overlooking a marina. My hands were steady this time. When the final signature dried, Blue Haven Shores was mine. Majority shareholder, controlling interest, operational authority. I didn't announce it publicly right away. Corporate transitions require strategy, staff restructuring, rebranding plans. I visited the property anonymously first, walking the lobby they loved so much. I saw the worn carpet edges, the distracted front desk clerks, the overworked housekeeping staff moving too quickly to be appreciated. I spoke to employees privately. I listened. I promised changes without revealing who I was yet. That July, like clockwork, my family booked their annual trip. Same oceanfront suite, same balcony photos. They had no idea the ownership transfer had finalized weeks earlier. I closed my phone slowly. For the first time, I wasn't outside the frame. I was the one holding the camera. The morning my family arrived at Blue Haven Shores, I was already there. Not in the oceanfront suite, not by the infinity pool. I was in a small executive office behind the lobby reviewing staff briefings with the new operations manager I had appointed 2 weeks earlier. His name was Simone Carter, a sharp, composed woman who had worked her way up from front desk to regional management. I chose her because she understood people, not just profits, and because when I told her quietly, no employee here should ever feel small, she nodded like she'd been waiting her whole career to hear that. We had made subtle changes in the short time since the acquisition, adjusted scheduling to prevent burnout, increased wages for housekeeping, revised guest interaction protocols so service felt personal but not performative. I had walked through every corridor, every storage room, every staff lounge. I knew exactly what my family would see and what they wouldn't. At 11:32 a.m., the front desk alerted me that the Hawthorne reservation had arrived. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with something steadier, anticipation. I stood in the back corridor where I could see the lobby without being seen. Darren stepped in first, sunglasses perched on his forehead like a crown. Clarissa followed, already filming a story on her phone. My mother trailed behind, admiring the chandelier. My father walked slower, leaning slightly heavier on his cane than last year. For a moment, watching them from that distance, I didn't feel anger. I felt distance, like I was observing characters in a play I used to live inside. The front desk staff greeted them warmly. "Welcome back to Blue Haven Shores, Mr. Hawthorne." Darren puffed slightly with pride at the recognition. He leaned on the counter casually. "You know us, same suite as always." Simone stepped forward gracefully. "We're delighted to have you again." She gestured subtly to the refreshed floral arrangement on the desk, one of the small upgrades we'd implemented. Clarissa whispered to her phone, "They always treat us so special." I almost smiled, because this time, the special treatment wasn't obligation, it was policy crafted by me. As they moved toward the elevators, Darren laughed loudly. "See, Mom, this is what real hospitality looks like." My mother nodded approvingly. Lila should take notes. The words landed softer now, not because they weren't cruel, but because they were outdated. I waited until they had settled into their suite before making my move. I didn't want drama in the lobby. I didn't want spectacle. I wanted control. I changed into a tailored navy dress, professional, understated, authoritative. Not flashy, not theatrical, just unmistakably in charge. Then I asked Simone to arrange a courtesy visit to their suite from ownership. She raised an eyebrow slightly but didn't question me. When I knocked on the oceanfront door, I heard Clarissa's laugh from inside. Darren opened it mid-sentence. His expression froze. It took him 3 full seconds to process what he was seeing. "Lila," he said, confusion pulling his eyebrows together. Behind him, Clarissa lowered her phone slowly. My mother stood near the balcony doors, eyes widening. I held my posture steady. "Good afternoon," I said calmly. "I wanted to personally welcome you to Blue Haven Shores." Darren blinked. "What do you mean, personally?" I stepped inside without waiting to be invited. The suite looked exactly like the photos they posted every year. White linen, polished wood, ocean stretching endlessly beyond glass. I turned to face them fully. "As of this spring, I'm the majority owner." Silence. Not the awkward kind, the seismic kind. Clarissa let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Owner of what?" I met her gaze evenly. "This resort." Darren's mouth opened, then closed. My father shifted his weight, staring at me as though I'd begun speaking another language. My mother's lips parted slightly. "Lila," she whispered, "don't joke like that." "I'm not joking." I reached into my portfolio and placed a neatly folded document on the glass coffee table. It bore the official letterhead, my name printed clearly beneath the title, Managing Partner and Majority Shareholder. Darren stared at it but didn't touch it, as if it might burn him. Clarissa's face lost color. "That's not possible," she murmured. I tilted my head slightly. "Why not?" She didn't answer. Because the real answer would have been too honest. Because in their minds, I had been the maid, and maids don't own resorts. My father cleared his throat. "Since when?" "The deal closed in April. I've been overseeing operational changes since." My mother's eyes filled, not with pride, but with something closer to confusion. "Why didn't you tell us?" There it was, the question I had rehearsed answering in my head for months. I kept my voice gentle. Every time I spoke about hospitality, it was called glorified cleaning. I decided to let my work speak for itself. Darren finally picked up the document, scanning it quickly. His jaw tightened. "So what, this is some kind of revenge stunt?" I felt the faintest flicker of hurt at that, because even now he couldn't imagine ambition that wasn't about him. "No," I said softly, "this is business." Clarissa crossed her arms defensively. "You're trying to embarrass us." "I knocked on the door privately. You're the ones raising your voices." My father sank slowly into a chair. "You bought whole this place?" "With partners, yes." The ocean waves crashed faintly against the shore below, a steady rhythm beneath the silence. My mother finally stepped forward. "We always knew you were capable," she began weakly. I held her gaze, not unkindly. "Did you?" She faltered, because the truth hovered between us, undeniable. Darren exhaled sharply. "So what now? You're our boss?" The word sounded strange in his mouth. I shook my head slightly. "No, you're guests, just like everyone else." Clarissa's eyes flickered with something I had never seen directed at me before. Not mockery, not dismissal, uncertainty. "Why are you telling us this?" she asked quietly. I paused. This was the moment that mattered, not the reveal, the intention. "Because, for years," I said evenly, "you called me the maid in my own family, and I let it. I cleaned up after you, I stayed small so you could feel big. I won't do that anymore." No shouting, no tears, just truth. Darren looked away first. My father stared at the carpet. My mother's shoulders trembled slightly. Clarissa said nothing at all. I straightened my posture. "Enjoy your stay. If there's anything you need, our staff will assist you." They are exceptional people, and they deserve respect. I let that sentence linger intentionally. Then I walked to the door. Darren's voice stopped me just before I reached it. Lila. I turned slowly. He struggled for words. I didn't realize. I studied his face. The arrogance was gone, replaced with something raw. Maybe regret, maybe simply shock. You didn't try to, I said gently. And then I left the suite, closing the door behind me with quiet finality. When the elevator doors closed behind me, I didn't collapse into tears the way people imagine in moments like that. I didn't shake. I didn't tremble. I stood very still, watching my reflection in the mirrored walls. For the first time in my life, I saw a woman who did not look apologetic for taking up space, and that steadiness felt more powerful than any dramatic outburst could have. But strength doesn't mean you don't feel. As I walked back through the lobby, greeting staff, answering a question from the concierge, reviewing a floral delivery, my chest held a tight ache I couldn't quite name. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't revenge. It was grief. Grief for the years I had tried to earn love by shrinking. That afternoon, I received a text from Darren. We need to talk. No emojis, no jokes, just that. I didn't respond right away. I had a staff roundtable scheduled, and I wasn't about to derail the culture I was building for the sake of family discomfort. In the staff lounge, I sat among housekeepers, servers, maintenance workers. I asked them what needed improvement. One young woman named Tasha hesitated before speaking. Sometimes guests treat us like we're invisible, she admitted quietly, like we're just part of the furniture. My throat tightened. I nodded. That changes now, I said calmly. No one who works here is invisible, not on my watch. They didn't know my full story. They didn't need to, but I think they felt the sincerity in my voice. Later that evening, Darren came down alone. I saw him approaching from across the lobby, his usual swagger absent. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but energetically. Can we step outside? He asked. We walked onto a quiet terrace overlooking the ocean. The sun was beginning to dip, painting the water gold. He leaned on the railing, exhaling heavily. Why didn't you tell us you were doing all this? He asked again, softer this time. I folded my hands calmly. I tried to tell you over the years. You laughed. He rubbed the back of his neck. We were joking. You were comfortable, I corrected gently. There's a difference. He was silent for a long moment. The waves filled the space between us. Did we really make you feel that small? He asked finally. I looked at him then, really looked. He wasn't being sarcastic. He was searching. And that's when I realized something painful and liberating at the same time. They hadn't woken up every morning plotting to diminish me. They simply benefited from my compliance. And when someone benefits from your silence, they rarely question it. Yes, I said quietly. You did. His jaw tightened. I thought you liked helping. I do, I replied, but helping is different from being assigned a role you never chose. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. Clarissa feels embarrassed, he admitted. I let out a soft breath. Embarrassment fades, patterns don't. That's what matters. He looked out at the water again. So what, you're just better than us now? There it was, the familiar defensiveness. I shook my head. No, I'm simply not beneath you anymore. That landed. I could see it in the way his shoulders dropped slightly. For years, our family dynamic had relied on hierarchy. Darren, the golden son, Clarissa, the polished wife, me, the dependable background support. When one person steps out of a role, the whole structure wobbles. Mom's pretty shaken, he added quietly. I nodded. She built her identity around certain narratives. I disrupted one. He huffed a weak laugh. You always were dramatic. I smiled faintly. No, I was patient. That night, I returned to my office long after the guests had settled. I sat alone, lights dimmed, listening to the distant hush of the ocean. I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt reflective. Buying the resort hadn't erased the years of hurt. It hadn't magically healed the moments I stood at kitchen sinks while they toasted each other's achievements. But it had done something more important. It had ended the lie that I was only as valuable as the service I provided. The next morning, I received a knock at my office door. It wasn't Darren, it was my mother. She stepped inside slowly, as if crossing into unfamiliar territory. She looked around at the framed development plans, the staff recognition plaques, the occupancy charts pinned neatly to the board. "This is yours?" she asked quietly. "Yes," I said. She sat down carefully in the chair across from me. For a long time she didn't speak. Then her voice trembled. "I thought you were struggling." I studied her face. "Why?" She blinked, caught off guard. "Because you never bragged." I let out a soft exhale. I was taught that humility was virtue, but humility without acknowledgement becomes invisibility. Her eyes filled. "I never meant to make you feel invisible." I believed her. Intent and impact are rarely twins. "I know," I said gently, "but you didn't correct it either." She looked down at her hands. "Your father always praised Darren so loudly. I suppose I followed." "And when he called me Cinderella?" I asked quietly. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I should have stopped him. That was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from her, and strangely, it was enough. Not because it erased the past, but because it acknowledged it. She reached across the desk hesitantly. "I am proud of you," she whispered. The words felt different now, not performative, not public, just between us. I nodded slowly. "Thank you." We sat in silence for a moment, not as golden child and overlooked daughter, but as two flawed women understanding each other a little better. When she left, I felt something shift again. Not power this time, peace. Later that afternoon, I saw Clarissa by the pool. She looked uncomfortable, unsure whether to approach me. Eventually, she did. "You didn't realize you were building all this," she said carefully. "You never asked," I replied evenly. She winced slightly. "I thought the Maid comments were harmless." I held her gaze steadily. "Harmless jokes don't linger for years." She swallowed. "I'm sorry. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't eloquent, but it was real. And sometimes real is enough." As the sun set on their final night at Blue Haven Shores, my family gathered for dinner at the resort restaurant. I joined them, not as staff, not as background support, but as an equal at the table. The conversation was quieter than usual, more thoughtful. Darren asked questions about occupancy rates. My father listened instead of interrupting. My mother watched me with something new in her eyes. Respect. And for the first time in my adult life, no one asked me to clear the plates. Dinner that night didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like recalibration. We sat around a table overlooking the ocean, the same kind of table I had once imagined myself serving from, not sitting at. The candlelight flickered between us, and for the first time I noticed how unsure my family looked without their usual script. Darren wasn't dominating the conversation. Clarissa wasn't curating the moment for social media. My father wasn't issuing loud opinions. It was quieter, almost fragile. The waiter approached to clear the plates after dessert, and instinctively my hands moved forward to stack them. Years of muscle memory, years of conditioning. Then I stopped myself. Slowly, deliberately, I placed my hands back in my lap. The waiter smiled politely and gathered everything without assistance. It was such a small act, but it felt monumental. My mother noticed.
Her eyes flickered to my hands, then back to my face. She didn't say anything, but I saw the recognition there. Later, as we stood to leave, Darren lingered behind with me while the others walked ahead. "You know," he began, voice low, "when you knocked on that sweet door, I felt like the ground dropped out from under me." I glanced at him. "Why?" He hesitated. "Because I realized I never actually asked what you were capable of. I just assumed I knew." I nodded slowly. "Assumptions are comfortable." He let out a humorless laugh. "Yeah, they are." We walked toward the lobby in silence. The staff greeted me respectfully as we passed, not with exaggerated deference, but with professional acknowledgement. Darren noticed. "They respect you," he said quietly. "Respect is different from fear," I replied. "I don't need them to be afraid of me." He studied that for a moment. "I think I was afraid," he admitted. I stopped walking. "Of what?" "Of you not needing us anymore." The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. I had spent so many years believing they felt superior. It had never occurred to me that my growth might threaten their sense of stability. "I never needed you the way you thought," I said gently. "I just wanted you." That distinction hung heavy between us. Want and need are not the same. Needing someone creates dependency. Wanting them creates choice. The next morning, before checkout, I invited my family to join me for a brief tour behind the scenes, not to show off, but to educate. We walked through service corridors they had never seen, storage rooms, laundry facilities, staff lounges. Clarissa's eyes widened as she watched the coordinated choreography of housekeeping preparing sweets at record speed. "It's like an army," she whispered. I smiled faintly. "It's leadership." Tasha, the young housekeeper who had spoken up during the staff meeting, greeted us shyly. I introduced her by name. I told her she'd suggested a process improvement that increased efficiency by 12%. Her face lit up. My father looked surprised. "You track all that?" he asked. "Every detail," I replied. "Details are what separate good service from excellence." Darren ran a hand along a freshly stocked linen cart. "I never thought about how much goes into this," he admitted. "You didn't have to," I said. "That's the point of good management. Guests enjoy, staff execute, ownership strategizes." Clarissa glanced at me sideways. "And where do you fit?" I met her gaze calmly. "Everywhere." By the time we returned to the lobby, something had shifted, not just in them, in me. I wasn't proving anything anymore. I wasn't waiting for validation. I was simply standing in my truth. When checkout time came, Darren approached the front desk to settle incidental charges. He pulled out his card confidently, but Simone gently informed him, "Your stay has been fully covered by ownership." He looked at me sharply. "You didn't have to do that." I shrugged lightly. "I wanted to." He hesitated. "Is this part of the statement?" I shook my head. "No, it's a gift." He searched my face for sarcasm and found none. My mother hugged me tightly before they left. "You've built something beautiful, not just the resort." I held her a moment longer than usual. "We're all still building," I replied softly. After they drove away, the lobby felt oddly still. I stood there for a while, absorbing everything. The scent of polished wood, the distant hum of the fountain, the steady rhythm of staff moving with purpose. I had imagined this moment for years, the reveal, the shift in power, but what I hadn't anticipated was the quiet that followed. Revenge would have been louder. It would have required humiliation, public spectacle. Instead, what I felt was closure. That evening, alone in my office, I opened my laptop and scrolled through old photos, not the resort's marketing images, family pictures, holidays, birthdays, Sunday dinners where I stood slightly off-center, half in the frame, half out. I studied my own expression in those photos, the polite smile, the careful posture, the subtle way I angled myself toward the kitchen as if already anticipating the cleanup. I didn't hate that version of me. She survived the only way she knew. She believed love had to be earned through usefulness, and in some families, that belief becomes generational. But survival isn't the same as thriving. A week later, back home, Darren hosted another Sunday dinner. For a moment, I considered declining out of habit. Old instincts die slowly. But I went. When I arrived, Clarissa greeted me differently, not with a stack of napkins, not with instructions, just a simple, "Hi, Leela." I stepped inside cautiously, aware that dynamics don't transform overnight. During dinner, my father asked me about occupancy projections for the fall season. My mother asked about staff development programs. Darren listened more than he spoke. And when the meal ended, something remarkable happened. No one moved. No one looked at me expectantly. Clarissa stood first. "Let's all clean up together," she said lightly. It wasn't grand, it wasn't dramatic, but it was new. I stood slowly, heart steady. As we cleared plates side by side, Darren handed me a dish towel. For a split second, the old sting flared. Then he said quietly, "Equal shift." I met his eyes. There was no mockery there, just acknowledgement. We washed dishes together in silence, not because I was the maid, but because we were family. And for the first time, I didn't feel like furniture. I felt like myself.
The weeks after that Sunday dinner felt unfamiliar in the quietest way. No dramatic declarations, no sudden personality overhauls, just small, consistent shifts. And I've learned that real change rarely announces itself with fireworks. It whispers. It tests the ground. It waits to see if it's safe to stay. Clarissa started texting me about things other than logistics. Not, "Can you bring ice?" or "Can you come early to help set up?" but actual questions. "How did you know the resort would succeed? Weren't you scared to invest?" The first time she asked, I stared at the message longer than I'd like to admit. For years, she had spoken to me like I was background noise. Now she was asking for insight. I replied honestly. I was terrified. I just decided fear wasn't a reason to stay small. She didn't respond immediately. Later that night, she sent, "I don't think I've ever done something that scared me on purpose." That message told me more about her than any apology could. Darren changed too, but in his own way. He didn't suddenly become soft or overly expressive. That wasn't him. Instead, he became attentive. At family gatherings, when conversations drifted toward dismissive jokes, he redirected them, subtly, firmly. One afternoon, my father started to say, "Well, Lila's always been good with a mop," and Darren cut in with, "Dad, she runs a multi-million-dollar operation. Let's not." It wasn't perfect, but it was different. My mother struggled the most, not because she doubted me, but because she had to confront something uncomfortable about herself. She had spent decades aligning with the loudest voice in the room, my father's, praising Darren's ambition because it was visible and traditional. She had never consciously chosen to diminish me. She had simply failed to interrupt it. One afternoon, she asked me to come over for tea, just the two of us. Her house looked the same as always, lace curtains, polished furniture, the faint scent of lemon cleaner. I sat at the same dining table where I had once stood scraping candle wax while they laughed. She poured tea carefully, hands slightly unsteady. "I've been thinking," she began. "That's usually how growth starts," I said gently. She gave me a faint, almost shy smile. "I realized something painful," she continued. "I praised your brother because I understood his path, promotions, titles, salaries. I didn't understand yours, so instead of asking, I minimized it." Her honesty settled between us like fragile glass. "I thought I was protecting you," she admitted, "keeping your expectations small so you wouldn't be disappointed." I inhaled slowly. "Mom," I said softly, "low expectations don't protect, they confine." Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they weren't rooted in guilt, they were rooted in realization. "You were never small," she whispered. "I just didn't look closely enough." For a moment, I was 32 years old at that kitchen sink. Then I wasn't. I was a woman who had chosen her own scale.
We sat in silence for a while, not heavy silence, just reflective. You know, she added quietly, when you were little, you used to rearrange your bedroom every few months. You said you were improving the guest experience. I laughed unexpectedly. I did? Yes, she smiled. You'd line up your stuffed animals and assign them check-in times. Something warm spread through my chest. I hadn't remembered that. I guess I've always been resort material, I murmured. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Yes, she said, you always were. That conversation healed something I hadn't even realized was still open. But healing doesn't mean forgetting. A month later, Blue Haven Shores hosted a regional hospitality conference. Industry leaders, investors, media representatives. It was the largest professional event I had ever overseen. My name was on the keynote schedule. The night before the conference, I stood alone on the terrace overlooking the ocean, the same place where Darren and I had talked weeks earlier. The air was cool, the waves steady. I thought about the girl who once believed she was only valuable if she was useful. I thought about the kitchen sinks, the stacked plates, the laughter, and I felt gratitude, not for the humiliation, but for the hunger it created. The next morning, the ballroom filled with polished executives in tailored suits. I stepped onto the stage, lights warm against my face. For a brief second, I felt the old instinct to shrink. Then I began. I spoke about service culture, about employee dignity, about how invisible labor sustains visible luxury. I talked about restructuring compensation models and reducing staff turnover by prioritizing respect. Midway through the speech, I said something I hadn't planned. Hospitality isn't about making guests feel superior. It's about making everyone feel seen. The room was silent. I continued. The most dangerous thing you can do to someone is convince them they are only as valuable as the work they perform for you. I didn't mention my family. I didn't need to. When the applause came, it wasn't thunderous. It was steady, sustained, respectful. Afterwards, investors approached, journalists requested interviews, opportunities expanded. But what moved me most wasn't the industry recognition. It was the text I received later that evening from Clarissa. I watched the live stream. You were incredible. I don't think I've ever seen someone so sure of themselves. A pause. I'm sorry for not seeing it sooner. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. Growth counts even when it's late. She sent back a small heart. Not dramatic, not performative, just real. Months passed. The family dynamic continued adjusting, not perfectly, but progressively. Darren stopped using humor as armor quite so often. My father began asking more questions instead of issuing conclusions. My mother started introducing me differently to extended relatives. This is my daughter Lila. She owns Blue Haven Shores. Not works at, not helps with, owns. The first time she said it publicly, I almost corrected her out of habit, but I didn't, because it was true. One evening, as autumn settled in and the resort's peak season slowed down, I walked through the lobby after closing hours. The chandelier reflected softly on polished floors. Staff waved goodnight as they left. I paused near the front desk. Years ago, I would have stood behind it, adjusting paperwork, hoping someone would notice my effort. Now, I stood in front of it, not because I had escaped service, but because I had redefined it. The title never mattered as much as the ownership, of the building, yes, but more importantly, of myself. I thought back to that sentence Darren once said, just hire good maids, and I realized something important. There is nothing wrong with being a maid. There is only something wrong with being treated like you are only one thing. I had cleaned kitchens, I had washed dishes, I had scrubbed floors, and now I owned the place they vacationed at. Both things could be true, and neither diminished me. The ocean moved steadily outside, endless and unbothered. For the first time in my life, I felt the same.
Success has a strange way of attracting people who never noticed you before. Not just strangers, family too. By winter, Blue Haven Shores had stabilized under the new operational structure. Staff turnover had dropped significantly. Guest satisfaction had increased. Revenue was steady. Not explosive, not reckless, just sustainable. That was always my goal, stability with dignity. One afternoon, Darren called unexpectedly. I need advice, he said without preamble. I leaned back in my office chair, surprised by the tone. He didn't sound defensive. He didn't sound competitive. He sounded unsure. About what? I asked. I've been thinking about starting something on my own. Not insurance, something small, maybe consulting, he exhaled. But I don't know where to begin. I let the silence stretch for a moment. Years ago, I would have rushed to prove I was knowledgeable. Now, I simply listened. What's stopping you? I asked. Fear, I guess, and not wanting to look stupid if it fails. I smiled faintly to myself. You know what failure actually feels like? What? Being capable of more and never trying. He was quiet for several seconds. I never thought you were afraid, he admitted. I was terrified, I replied honestly. I just didn't let fear make my decisions. He laughed softly. You've changed. I considered that. No, I've revealed. That conversation marked a subtle shift in our relationship. Darren began asking questions, not as the older brother instructing, but as a peer seeking perspective. And I answered, not to prove superiority, but to share experience. Around the same time, Clarissa reached out with something unexpected. I've been offered a position at a marketing firm, she told me over coffee. It's a step up, but it would mean less time for appearances. I raised an eyebrow slightly. For social media, she clarified with a sheepish smile. I've been curating everything for so long that I don't know who I am without it. Her honesty surprised me. Why do you curate so much? I asked gently. She stared down at her cup. Because if everything looks perfect, no one asks questions. That sentence lingered between us. I realized then that the roles we'd played in the family weren't random. Darren had been the golden son, Clarissa had been the polished wife, I had been the dependable helper. We had all adapted to survive in the ecosystem we were given. Maybe imperfection is allowed now, I said quietly. She nodded slowly. Maybe. Meanwhile, my father remained more reserved. He didn't initiate deep conversations. He didn't apologize dramatically. But he watched me differently. When extended relatives visited, he'd mention my conference speech. When someone made an offhand comment about women in business, he corrected them firmly. Pride looks different in older men who were raised never to show vulnerability. One evening, he called me unexpectedly. I've been thinking about something you said, he began gruffly. Which part? I asked lightly. That respect is different from fear. I waited. I ran my household on fear, he admitted quietly. Thought that was leadership. The vulnerability in his voice felt unfamiliar. And was it? I asked. He sighed. It got obedience, not understanding. There it was, a truth decades in the making. I'm still learning, he added after a pause. So am I replied. Growth doesn't erase history, but it rewrites the future. At the resort, I continued refining systems. I introduced mentorship programs pairing senior staff with new hires. I created an employee scholarship fund for those pursuing hospitality certifications. I remembered what it felt like to have knowledge dismissed as trivial. I would not allow that culture to exist under my leadership. One afternoon, Tasha knocked on my office door. I got accepted into the management training program, she said breathlessly. I stood up and hugged her without hesitation. That's incredible, I told her. Thank you for believing I could do more, she whispered. Her words struck deeper than any investor praise, because that was the real victory. Not buying the resort, changing the culture inside it. As the year drew toward its end, something unexpected happened. My family decided to skip their usual July booking and instead asked if I would join them for a holiday dinner at my parents' house. Not as organizer, not as coordinator, just as daughter. I hesitated at first.
Old patterns echo loudly around holidays, but I agreed. When I arrived, the table was already set. Food was prepared, no stack of napkins waiting in the hallway, no subtle glances toward the kitchen. We sat together and conversation flowed easily. Darren shared updates about his consulting idea. Clarissa talked about her new job. My mother described a book club she'd joined. My father asked thoughtful questions. At one point, a distant cousin joked, "So, Leela, you still the family maid?" Before I could respond, Darren's voice cut through. "She owns the place we vacation at. Put some respect on her name." The cousin laughed awkwardly, realizing he'd miscalculated. I didn't feel the need to add anything, because the correction hadn't come from me. Later that night, after most guests had left, I found myself alone in the kitchen with my father. Plates were stacked by the sink. He picked one up. I instinctively reached for a towel. He shook his head gently. "I've got this," he said. I froze slightly. "It's just dishes," he added. But it wasn't just dishes. It was decades of unspoken hierarchy dissolving in the most ordinary way. We washed side by side in silence, not as authority and subordinate, not as golden sun shadow, just father and daughter. When I left that night, I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. I thought about the girl who had once believed that being useful was the same as being loved. I thought about the woman who bought a resort not out of revenge, but reclamation. And I realized something profound. Power isn't proven by humiliating others. It's proven by refusing to humiliate yourself. Blue Haven Shores still stood strong. My family still had flaws. I still carried scars. But none of those defined me anymore, because I had stepped out of the role they assigned and stepped fully into the one I chose. The ocean never asked permission to rise and fall. It simply did. And so did I.
There's a quiet truth no one tells you about growth. It doesn't just elevate you, it isolates you for a while. By early spring, nearly a year after I'd bought Blue Haven Shores, my life had expanded in ways I once only imagined. Industry recognition, strategic partnerships, invitations to speak. My calendar was full, my staff thriving, my system steady. On paper, everything looked complete. But in the stillness of my condo at night, after emails were answered and projections reviewed, I sometimes felt the echo of an old loneliness. For years, I had defined myself by usefulness to my family. Then I defined myself by proving I wasn't small. Now, without either pressure pushing me, I had to ask a new question. Who was I when I wasn't cleaning up or conquering something? That question lingered longer than any insult ever had. One evening, I stayed late at the resort, reviewing renovation proposals for a small expansion wing. The lobby lights were dimmed, the scent of polished wood and ocean air blending softly. I walked through the hall slowly, observing details most guests would never notice. A scuff on the baseboard, a flicker in a hallway light. Control had always comforted me. If I could improve something, I felt valuable. As I stepped onto the terrace, I saw Simone leaning against the railing, staring at the water. "Long day?" she asked without turning. "They all are," I replied lightly. She glanced at me. "You've built something solid here, but you look tired." I hesitated. Leaders aren't always encouraged to admit fatigue, but Simone had earned honesty. "I'm adjusting," I said carefully. "To what?" "To not fighting," I admitted. She nodded slowly. "You were in survival mode for a long time." That phrase settled deeply. Survival mode. It explained the constant drive, the need to prove, the hyper-awareness in every family gathering. "And now?" she prompted. "Now I don't know who I am without a battle." She smiled gently. "Maybe you're just a woman who runs a resort." It sounded simple, almost too simple, but simplicity can be healing. Around that time, something unexpected shifted in my personal life, too. A man named Gabriel had been consulting with us on sustainable design improvements. He was thoughtful, observant, patient, not flashy, not loud, the opposite of everything my family used to define as impressive. One afternoon, as we reviewed plans in my office, he paused mid-sentence. "You know," he said, "the way you talk about your staff, it's rare." "In what way?" I asked. "You don't talk about them like assets. You talk about them like people." I shrugged lightly. "They are people." He studied me for a moment longer than usual. "And who talks about you like that?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to respond, then closed it. For years, no one had. Not until recently, not until I demanded it. "I'm working on that," I said finally. Gabriel nodded as if that answer made sense. We started having coffee after meetings, conversations that weren't about contracts or budgets. He asked about my childhood. I told him pieces, not all at once. The kitchen sink, the jokes, the reveal. He didn't react with outrage or pity. He simply listened. "You bought a resort," he said, shaking his head in quiet amazement, "not to show off, but to redefine yourself." "Yes," I replied. "That's not revenge," he said thoughtfully. "That's evolution." No one had framed it that way before. Evolution. It felt right. Meanwhile, my family continued adjusting to the new dynamic. Darren officially launched his consulting side business. It was modest at first, but it was his. He called me after his first client signed. "I did it," he said, almost disbelieving. "I knew you would," I replied. "You weren't jealous of me?" he asked suddenly. "Of what?" "Of me trying something new." I smiled softly. "Growth isn't a competition, Darren." There was a long pause. "I used to think it was," he admitted. "I know," I said gently. Clarissa, too, began shedding her curated persona. Her social media presence shifted from polished perfection to honest storytelling. She wrote once about feeling pressure to look flawless at every family event. The post resonated widely. She sent it to me before publishing. "Too vulnerable?" she asked. "Vulnerability is strength," I replied. She posted it. The response was overwhelming. For the first time, she wasn't performing, she was connecting. Even my father began changing in small, steady ways. He started volunteering at a local community center, mentoring young men about leadership and respect. One evening, he told me quietly, "I've been telling them about you." I raised an eyebrow. "About how I underestimated my own daughter," he clarified. That sentence carried more weight than any public praise ever could. Summer approached again, the anniversary of the reveal. Blue Haven Shores prepared for peak season, booking strong, staff morale high. The culture we had cultivated felt stable, rooted. One afternoon, I stood in the lobby watching guests check in, families laughing, children running ahead excitedly, couples holding hands. And I felt something unexpected, contentment. Not adrenaline, not vindication, just steady satisfaction. Gabriel joined me beside the front desk. "You look peaceful," he observed. "I am," I replied. "Do you ever miss who you were before all this?" he asked. I thought about it carefully. I miss her kindness, but not her silence. He nodded. "You don't have to lose one to keep the other." That sentence felt like permission. For years, I believed strength required hardness, that success required sharp edges. But maybe real strength was integration. That night, I sat alone on the terrace again, watching the ocean rise and fall in endless rhythm. I remembered the girl at the sink. I remembered the woman signing acquisition papers. And I realized they were not opposites. They were chapters. Being called a maid in my own family once felt like humiliation. Now it felt like origin.
Because that's where I learned attention to detail, resilience, observation, patience. Every plate I scrubbed taught me something about structure. Every joke I endured sharpened my awareness. Every dismissal fueled quiet strategy. They thought I was just cleaning up. I was studying the system. And now, standing at the helm of something I built, I understood the final truth. The insult was never the limitation. Believing it would have been. The ocean stretched endlessly in front of me, horizon blurring into twilight. For years, I thought success meant standing above those who belittled you. Now I know it meant standing firmly within yourself, unshaken, unapologetic, unassigned.
The second summer after I bought Blue Haven Shores arrived softer than the first. The air felt warmer, but my heart felt steadier. There was no secret waiting to be revealed this time, no dramatic knock on an oceanfront suite door. Just rhythm, routine, leadership, and choice. My family didn't automatically book their usual week that year. Instead, Darren called me in early June. "We were thinking," he began carefully, "that maybe we shouldn't assume." "Assume what?" I asked, though I already knew. "That we're entitled to stay there." The word entitled lingered between us. It was new in his vocabulary. "You're welcome as guests," I said evenly, "like anyone else." "Not as family privilege?" he asked. "There is no family privilege," I replied gently. "There's just policy." He exhaled slowly. "Okay, then we'll book properly." And they did. They paid the rate listed like every other guest. No discounts requested, no expectations implied. That simple act meant more to me than any apology ever could. When they arrived, I didn't hide in back corridors. I greeted them in the lobby openly, professionally, warmly. "Welcome back," I said. This time, Darren didn't puff up with pride at being recognized. He nodded respectfully to the staff. Clarissa thanked the front desk agent by name. My father shook the bellman's hand. Change doesn't happen in speeches. It shows up in small behaviors. Midweek, I invited them to join a staff appreciation luncheon, not to showcase them, but to expose them to something they'd never truly seen before, the human side of hospitality. We gathered in a private conference room. Housekeepers, servers, maintenance staff, front desk agents, everyone sat together at long tables, no hierarchy. I stood to speak briefly. "This place runs because of you," I said simply, "not because of ownership, not because of marketing, because of your care." Then I sat. No grandstanding. Afterward, Darren approached one of the maintenance supervisors and asked about his workflow. Clarissa complimented the pastry chef directly. My mother listened to Tasha describe her management training progress with genuine interest. I watched quietly. Years ago, they would have treated this as a behind-the-scenes curiosity. Now they treated it as reality. That evening, Darren and I walked along the shoreline. "I used to think success was being served," he admitted. "And now?" I asked. "I think it's understanding what goes into the service." I smiled faintly. "That's a more sustainable definition." He nodded. "You know what bothered me most?" he continued. "When you revealed you owned this place, it wasn't just shock. It was realizing I never asked what you wanted." The honesty in his voice was steady now, not defensive. "What do you want, Leela?" he asked quietly. The question felt different this time, not dismissive, not rhetorical. I considered it carefully. "I want respect without proving, peace without shrinking, love without conditions." He swallowed. "He think we're learning," he said. "Yes," I replied. "We are." Meanwhile, something inside me continued evolving too. Gabriel's presence in my life had become consistent, calm, supportive. He didn't treat my accomplishments as spectacle, he treated them as context. One evening during that same week, he joined us for dinner at the resort restaurant. I had hesitated before inviting him, unsure how the dynamic would feel. To my surprise, my family welcomed him easily. Darren asked about sustainability initiatives. Clarissa complimented the pastry chef directly. My mother asked how we met. Not interrogations, interest. At one point, my father looked at Gabriel and said, "She's always been stronger than we realized." Gabriel glanced at me and smiled slightly. "I don't think she ever realized it either." I laughed softly. He wasn't wrong. After dinner, as everyone dispersed, Gabriel stayed back with me on the terrace. "Are you happy?" he asked. The simplicity of the question caught me. I didn't answer immediately. I looked at the ocean, steady and endless. "Yes," I said finally, "not because I proved anything, but because I don't have to anymore." He nodded. "That's different from victory," he observed. "It's better," I replied. Later that same week, something unexpected happened. A young housekeeper approached me hesitantly. "Miss Leela?" she said softly. "Yes?" "I heard from Tasha that you started in hospitality young too." "I did," I replied. "My family thinks I should quit and find something more respectable," she admitted, voice wavering. "They say cleaning rooms isn't success." The words hit a familiar chord. I looked at her carefully. "Respect isn't in the task, it's in the ownership of it. You can build a career here if you choose, but it has to be your choice, not their dismissal." Tears filled her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. As she walked away, I felt the full circle of it. Once, I was the girl no one defended. Now, I was the woman who could defend others. That night, I gathered my family in the lounge overlooking the ocean, not for drama, not for revelation, just conversation. "I want to say something," I began. They looked at me attentively. "For years, I let myself be defined by what I did for you, not by who I was." No one interrupted. "I don't blame you entirely," I continued. "I participated in that dynamic. I stayed silent. I accepted roles." Darren shook his head slightly, but I raised a hand gently. "We all did what we knew, but we don't have to keep doing it." Clarissa nodded, eyes soft. My father cleared his throat. "You've changed this family," he said quietly. I considered that. "No," I replied. "I changed myself. The rest adjusted." Silence settled around us, but it wasn't tense. It was reflective. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was sitting at the edge of the table. I felt centered. The next morning, as my family prepared to leave, Darren hugged me tightly. "Proud of you," he said simply. "No qualifiers, no comparisons." Clarissa hugged me next. "Thank you for not humiliating us," she whispered. "I never wanted to," I replied. My mother held my face in her hands for a long moment. "You were never the maid." I smiled gently. "I know." After they left, I stood in the lobby watching new guests arrive. The cycle continued, the ocean moved, the staff worked, the systems functioned. But inside me, something had settled permanently. I no longer needed to buy buildings to feel significant. I no longer needed to shrink to feel accepted. The girl at the sink and the woman at the helm were finally the same person, and that wholeness felt richer than any resort I could ever own. The night before the annual Hawthorne family vacation, I stood alone on the balcony of the presidential suite, looking out over the ocean that now belonged, in a very real sense, to me. The moonlight painted the water silver, waves folded into themselves with a soft, patient rhythm. Down below, the resort staff prepared for the arrival of our most demanding guests. The Hawthorns always requested the best suites, the most attentive service, the kind of treatment that required the invisible labor of women like the woman I used to be. This time, the difference was simple and monumental. I was not invisible anymore. I had debated for weeks about whether to attend their welcome dinner. As the new majority owner of the property, I technically didn't need to show my face. I could have let my management team handle everything. I could have stayed in my office and watched the security cameras the way I had watched them on countless lonely nights while learning the business from the ground up. But this story deserved a final scene, and I deserved to walk into it standing tall. When the Hawthorns arrived the next afternoon, they did not recognize the subtle changes. They swept through the marble lobby with the same careless entitlement I remembered from years ago. My sister-in-law, Brenda, pointed out the fresh floral arrangements and commented loudly that they were finally upgrading. My brother Michael complained about the speed of the bell service. My mother adjusted her pearls and said, "At least they've learned to treat us properly." They didn't know that the woman overseeing every polished surface and every neatly folded towel was the same woman they once ordered to scrub wine stains from the carpet during their Christmas party. I waited until evening. The welcome dinner was held on the terrace overlooking the sea. Candlelight flickered against crystal glasses. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and jasmine. I chose a simple navy dress, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed for attention. I wanted the truth of my presence to be the only spectacle. When I stepped onto the terrace, conversation softened in small ripples. The general manager walked beside me, announcing me formally as our new majority owner. For a heartbeat, there was silence, then confusion, then disbelief. My mother's glass paused halfway to her lips. Michael's smile froze. Brenda's eyebrows lifted so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline. I could see the calculations running behind their eyes. The same family who once debated whether I was contributing enough to gatherings now realized I owned the ground beneath their chairs. Michael recovered first. He forced a laugh. "Is this some kind of joke?" I met his gaze steadily. "No, it's not." My voice did not shake. That was the quiet victory. Brenda's tone turned syrupy sweet. "We had no idea you were involved in hospitality." "I've been involved for quite some time," I said. "You just never asked." My mother set her glass down with deliberate care. "You should have told us," she said, as if I had committed a social oversight. "I did," I replied softly, "in different ways. You just didn't listen." There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just a shift in gravity. For the rest of the dinner, they were painfully polite. They complimented the food. They thanked the staff. They avoided direct references to the past, but the past sat at the table with us like an uninvited guest. After dessert, Michael pulled me aside near the railing. The ocean below us churned in darkness. "You could have said something," he insisted quietly. "All those years, you let us think that—" "I was small," I finished for him. He looked away. "That you needed help." "I did need help, just not the kind you were offering." He swallowed hard. "We didn't mean to make you feel less." The thing about apologies is that they sometimes arrive too late to change the damage, but they can still change the direction of the future. "I know," I said, and I meant it, but intent doesn't erase impact. For the first time in our adult lives, he had no comeback, no easy joke, no deflection. Over the next few days, I watched something extraordinary happen. My family treated the staff with gentleness. They tipped generously. They said please and thank you. They stood straighter in my presence, not out of fear, but out of awareness. It wasn't power that shifted them, it was perspective. They finally understood what it meant to be overlooked. On the final night of their stay, my mother asked to speak with me privately. We sat in the garden courtyard where lanterns glowed softly against the palm trees. "You never wanted me to feel like the help," she said, her voice lower than I'd ever heard her. "I thought giving you tasks made you useful." I smiled sadly. "I was always useful. I just wanted to be valued." She nodded slowly. For once, she did not argue. "You've done something remarkable," she admitted. "I'm proud of you." Those words I had once chased like a starving child, and yet hearing them now felt different, not because I didn't care, but because I no longer depended on them. "I'm proud of me too," I said gently, and that was the truest sentence I'd spoken all week. When the Hawthorns checked out the next morning, they hugged me, not awkwardly, not theatrically, just simply. Brenda squeezed my hand and whispered, "You really showed us." But that wasn't the point. I hadn't done this to prove them wrong. I had done it to prove myself right. After they left, I walked through the resort alone, past the front desk, through the kitchen, into the laundry room where sheets were pressed and folded with care. I stopped beside one of the housekeepers and helped her stack fresh linens onto a cart. She looked startled at first. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know, but I want to." The difference between being forced to serve and choosing to help is dignity. I made it a rule from that day forward that every employee at the resort would feel seen. We improved wages. We created pathways for promotion. We hosted appreciation dinners where the housekeepers sat at the front tables, not the back, because I remembered what it felt like to be treated like background noise. Years later, when the Hawthorns continued their annual vacations, they did so with humility. They still enjoyed the sweets, they still ordered fine wine, but they never again spoke down to the staff. And me? I no longer saw myself through their old labels. I saw a woman who turned humiliation into strategy, a woman who built quiet strength while others mistook her silence for weakness, a woman who learned that revenge is loud, but restoration is quiet. They called me a maid in my own family, and in a way, they were right. I cleaned up more than spills and dishes. I cleaned up my own self-doubt. I scrubbed away the belief that love must be earned through service. I polished my confidence until it reflected back something unshakable. Buying the resort wasn't about power. It was about reclaiming the narrative. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't making others bow. It's standing tall without needing them to. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been assigned a role that shrank you, remember this: the story doesn't end where someone else defines you. It ends where you decide who you are. And that decision, whispered quietly to yourself in the dark, can change everything.